Hey guys, I'm Dave.
And I'm Len.
And welcome to Wargame Chat. Today we're going to talk about the games with the best components as far as war games. Obviously, as far as war games with the best components, one without miniatures, this is the best one here. As far as something just with counters, Freezing Inferno, very good. My second favorite would be Academy Games, has really good components. And then GMT Games usually has good components too.
Games may be hard to play, but the components are good.
Yeah.
Can't complain about that.
Yep.
Because they have their super smart game testers.
Mm-hmm. And then you also have the ones with miniatures like Memoir 44 and Battlecry. Those have great components.
Yes. I was wondering, is it really that important to have little plastic figures as opposed to like squares?
Well, most of the people are going to like the figures better, but the problem is with the figures, generally it doesn't have the combat or movement values written on it. But they get away with that in like Memoir 44 and Battlecry because they're using custom dice, and the custom dice are the CRT themselves, you know what I mean? But yeah, the advantage of the counters is you have all the information you need right there. You can just look at it. You don't have to look anywhere else to get any information on the unit. Yeah,
and also counters you could kind of stack. If you got a rule system where sometimes you just lose like one unit at a time and the stacks get lower and lower.
Mm-hmm. And
with plastic figures, that's hard to do.
Yeah, well, with plastic figures, I mean, if you're doing like steps, I mean, you could have like 5 figures represents 5 steps or something, but you can do that with counters too. Like Freezing Inferno, basically each counter was its own step, so. But as far as other ones, let's see, what are some of your favorites as far as components? The old Avalon Hill was good too. Everything had a mounted map. Those had really good components for the time.
Well, the mounted map, because everybody's used to playing Monopoly or something like that, where you had a mounted map. So that was your standard of excellence.
But they got bought out by, Monarch Publishing or whatever, and so they can make their own mounted maps. So I think SPI didn't really have any games with mounted maps.
Well, they had a few, like...
they did?
Special editions.
Oh, okay. But I mean, typically they're just paper maps with SPI.
Yeah, because one thing that they showed was that if the subject was good, people were willing to accept paper maps.
Yeah.
Because a lot of war games are just, you're fighting on maps.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on a strategic or operational level or campaign, you're fighting on a map. So it didn't matter whether it was mounted or it was on a piece of paper.
Well, if you're going to play the game a lot, though, you want it to be mounted because with the folding and unfolding of the paper map, it starts to rip and stuff. So after a while, the map doesn't look so good after you've played enough games with it.
And one thing is also with counters. I remember the old days when you had a counter sheet. And to get the counters out, they were, it was highly punched. So you had to put it on a block of wood with an X-Acto knife. Mm-hmm. And I remember my classic was Legion Games had one called the Battle of Adobe Walls. And it's easy to punch out counters. So I picked up the counter sheet and turned it sideways, and half the counters fell out. And I said, yep. Truth in advertising.
Yeah.
I remember the old days when you had to punch these things out. Now they just fall out. And
I've had a few games where the counters were so hard to get out. When you push them out, some of them would rip. But then I learned that when you get a sheet like that, you just take out a scissors and you actually use a scissors to assist when punching it out so you don't rip the counter. But that's still a headache.
Yeah, or X-Acto knives. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And of course, I'm trying to remember, there's one game that I complained about, the Fallujah game, about some of the counters were hard to read.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, this is, they could have made the counters a little big, because the Marine Corps companies were color-coded, so that was it. But some of the engineering or armored companies was like, okay, is it BF or AF? Wait a minute, because one of them goes in this group, or and the other one goes in that group, or whatever.
Some of these old games from like the 1970s and 1980s, I mean, you need a magnifying glass just to read the values on the counter. They're using those crappy half-inch counters, and the writing's so small on them, it's hard to read.
Yeah, and I suppose nowadays, if I look at any old SPI game from like the 1970s, it's very hard to read some of those. Nowadays, I don't ask questions. Should I? Now, it used to be where if you got one, you finally got one. Should I punch this out and play? But if I do, I ruin the resale value. Nowadays, you don't worry about that because it's probably you won't be able to play it because the counters are so hard to read. One thing I always liked when Decision Games in World at War, some of their early games were reprints of earlier
SPI games.
Games that, because I remember one of the second or third one was the Solomon's campaign, because it's the only one that had the complete campaign of the entire island chain, not just Guadalcanal, but you could go on to New Georgia and Bougainville and fun places like that. But instead of punching out my original counter, there we got a new one with bigger counters that are thicker and easier to read. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
As far as other games, the Warhammer and Warhammer 40K series of board games always have great components. I mean, they have the plastic models, which look great. I mean, they're just like their miniatures that they sell for their miniature games, and those will always have a mounted map and so on and so forth, and really good components.
So.
But anyhow, that's all I got. You got anything else?
No, that's about it.
All right, this was a short one, guys. We'll have something new for you next week. Have a good one.
Okay.